These are laws which I am explaining. They're rules which we are bound by if we live in the three-dimensional space-time continuum called space-time, period. If we live in this continuum, which, if anybody has a way to completely get out of that, let me know, okay? But as long as you're living in the laws that govern this continuum of reality, you're bound by them, period. These laws do not have exceptions. They are 100% in effect at all times and places. This is how consciousness creates reality. That's what we're ultimately talking about here. And what we're talking about is the barriers to realizing how these laws work. Why don't we understand this as a whole? Why are we getting things that we don't really want in our experience? Why are we experiencing self-inflicted suffering? Well, it's because we don't understand how these laws work, which was part of the first part of the barriers to realization, largely due to being identified with the five senses. We're so identified with the matter, we don't understand the laws that arrange and govern the matter or the expression of it, which we call the events of our lives. We don't understand how they're being arranged like that through the underlying intelligence in consciousness. That's what is rearranging the field to give us what we are getting. And the only way we're going to ever get anything better than what we're getting is to come up in consciousness so we become conscious co-creators of reality in harmony with the natural laws of nature. That is the main creative force of the universe. The other creative force is our own free will. When our free will, through a rise in consciousness, comes into harmony and unison with the laws of nature, then we will be at one with those forces. We will be able to practically command them. Some people will say that he was a dark occultist. Some people will say that Francis Bacon was simply someone that understood these laws and these principles. He was a master Rosicrucian in the 1600s, and he made a statement that nature, to be commanded, must first be obeyed. If we ever want to get to the level of evolutionary development where nature would be at our beck and call and would align itself, its much greater will, with the will of our desires for ourselves, the only way that can ever come about is if we discover the principles of natural law and live in harmony with them. Period. The end. The end. There is no escaping that. There is no getting around that. Law with a capital L is not going to be broken by us. It is in effect, we are bound by it. What our job is to discover it, come into harmony with it, live in accordance with it, and then we will know harmony, then we will know peace, and then we will know freedom. And not a second until. Not a second until. So, the first barrier, five-sense illusion. I think we've covered that, and I've explained the dynamics fairly concisely. So, we're going to go into the next barrier to realization this evening, and we'll continue that through the remainder of the show, unless we have any callers call in that want to talk about anything else or bring up anything related to this. So the second barrier to self-realization is ego identification. This is totally related to the other barriers. It's related to the five-sense illusion, and it's intricately related to the prison of the left brain. How so? First of all, what do we mean when we say identification with ego? What are we talking about when we say ego? We're talking about identifying with the roles that we play in life. not understanding the deeper aspects of consciousness and self, but identifying with the lowercase s self. Okay? I am a security guard. I am a teacher. I am a railroad engineer. I am a soldier. I am a housewife and mother. Okay? These aren't who we are. It's not who we are down at the deep, deep, deep level. The level of self with a capital S. At the level of self with a capital S, we would say I am, period, nothing after it. We are being. We are consciousness. We are aliveness. We are life. We are dynamism. We are intelligence. We are self, capital S, period. No further explanation required. We are the expression of the all. These things that we identify with are simply roles that consciousness takes on in the flesh suit, so to speak. These are roles that we play here, down here on the stage, in the physical realm. So we're not the mother of someone else. We're not the father of someone else. We're not the child of someone else. We're not the soldier. We're not the cop. We're not the banker. We're not the golfer. We're not the businessman. These are roles. When, through forgetting our true nature, the true higher aspects of self, we become identified with the role, and we forget the true higher self. This is ego identification. Then my life is about my business. My life is about the role I play in the government institution I'm a member of. My life is about being that cop. My life being that sports celebrity, or being that high-paid athlete. My life is about being that actor on that famous television show. See, there's a huge difference between those things. Between understanding who and what we really are and becoming truly self-actualized beings, capital S, self. And then totally becoming absorbed, attached, and obsessed, even to the level of obsession with the role that we are playing in life. See, that's not who we are. That's what we're doing. You're doing the job of desk clerk. You're doing the job of actor. You're doing the job of banker. However, that isn't who we really are. So, to talk about the idea of ego attachment, with the identification of the roles that we play in life, and believing that they are the true self. What I'm going to do now is introduce and bring on a good friend of mine, Mr. Walter Rhodes. He is from the Philadelphia area. He is an independent researcher. He is an explorer of many Eastern consciousness traditions, and he is a seeker of truth. So he's going to come on and talk with us a little bit, and we'll have a discussion, and we'll fire opinions and observations back and forth for the remainder of the program tonight about ego identification. So, Walt, welcome to What on Earth is Happening. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So come on in a little closer and talk directly into the mic so everybody can hear you. So why don't you just chime in on what I have talked about so far in relation to ego identification as a barrier to self-realization, and give us a little bit of your take on that, and then we'll go back and forth and discuss it a little bit.
Okay, this may be a little bit different from the way you were going about it, but you read in popular literature how ego is illusionary. It's illusionary, it's illusionary. Seems to me the most prevalent illusion out there. Everybody has an ego. Every single, even, it almost seems as though animals have egos in a way. So I wanted to figure out where it comes from, evolutionarily speaking. What I found is, through reading various things, that ego developed early on as us as a species. So if we're walking through a forest and a tree branch breaks, if we have no ego, we will not recognize that tree branch as other.
Yes.
So it'll fall on your head and crush you.
Yes.
So the ego was developed to self-preserve, to preserve the organism.
Agreed.
To see the separation, not to be ruled by it.
That's right.
Now the separation seems to rule.
Yes.
Like I was saying to you before it started, we're born into this world and we pick elements of popular culture that we're fond of to build an ego itself out of. So we pick literature, music, sports, dance, all these things, and we build self out of them. Wouldn't you agree?
Sure.
Everybody does it.
Sure.
The funny part of that is the things that people cling the most to out of their list are the things that make them forget about themselves.
Right.
For example,
himself.
Yeah. So an athlete will cling to the fact that he loves being an athlete. Now, when he's playing that sport, he totally forgets about himself. He's 100% wrapped in it. So it's a total disillusion of self in that activity. Somebody that listens to music, they lose themselves in the act of listening to the music. And all these ego attachments, the ones that people cling to the hardest seems to be the ones that make them forget about themselves. It's weird.
I agree, and that's an interesting aspect that you brought up. And the aspect that you brought up that I could not agree with more is that the ego, in and of itself, isn't a problem per se. It's the attachment to the ego. It's the identification with it, believing that it is our true identity. That's why I list the barrier as not as ego, period, but as ego identification.
Or ego attachment.
Exactly.
Right.
Correct. Because, like you said, ego is simply an evolutionary development that allows us to see ourselves and understand that if I don't get out of the way of the falling huge tree, I'll be crushed, and then I won't have a body to experience, the three-dimensional world and grow in an evolution of.
So it's important to have an ego.
Sure.
Preserve yourself.
The ego is a tool for the three-dimensional aspect of self.
Right.
It's like ego is. It's been described by some researchers. I can't remember off the top of my head who brought this up, but ego, when we're both sitting at a table, let's say, as an example, ego is that which allows me to take my fork, scoop up some food, and put it in my mouth instead of yours.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Because I know I need to take that into myself. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, like you gave was a great example. If you don't get out of the way of a physical object coming your way, you're going to experience pain and suffering and possibly death. That's what the ego is intended for, intended to be used as a tool to expand the level of physical separation between the body and the objects that are in the physical world.
Right.
But it seems that ego took over the house, so to speak. It took over the temple of self.
Well, because there's no self-discipline. What I mean by that is it's okay to have likes. It's okay to have dislikes. It's even okay to be attached to things because we're human. If you have no self-discipline.
Right.
If you have no self, not outside imposed discipline, but actual self-discipline.
True.
You have no control over those attachments, and then they rule you.
Right.
So it's self-discipline, which is the important balance. To balance a mammoth ego, you have to have a mammoth self-discipline.
Right. This is what I've brought up on former shows as the concept that I call dominion, or true rulership of self, self-governance, in other words, and what many people term sovereignty, which is the true way out of the mess that we have created for ourselves. And I believe that you can only attain that when you understand the distinction between the lowercase s self, the physical body, and the higher self, higher level of awareness. And to do that, you must release your identification and attachment to ego.
Right.
And it's a process that these processes go hand in hand. And we're going to talk a little bit about, if we can get to it tonight, the left brain prison, the way of seeing the physical world in a purely left-brained way. The educational system keeps this going in the Western world. The types of media that we watch and are exposed to constantly, even a lot of the diet that we eat, is cutting off of our cutting us off from being able to have a full expression of self through getting in touch with the sacred feminine qualities that are imparted and we are able to experience through getting in touch with the right brain hemisphere.
Oh, see, this kind of plays right in there. What I was saying earlier about how people get attached to the ego, to the activities in their life that help them forget about themselves.
Right.
Like music and art and dance and sports and whatever. People are most attached to that because while they're doing it, they lose themselves and they unite with that force when
Right.
they're in that zone.
Right.
That helps them attach with that great feminine force.
Right.
With that unknown. So in a way, the ego attachments that people hold so sacred are not misaligned or misguided. They're the things that keep them in touch with
Right.
the force and the power that
Right.
is.
But then they start, when
They
they're
don't
not
have
in
the
that
perspective.
zone. Right.
They don't have the perspective to see it for
The
what it
difference.
is.
Right.
Right.
When they're not in that zone, they're attached with the actual activity, with identifying with this is who I am. This what I
Outside
can
of the
do.
zone.
Right.
Because that can't
Outside.
exist in the zone.
In that zone, they're feeling that oneness.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, they become attached to that because they've touched upon it by in doing that activity. But
Right.
then they start thinking that the activity itself is them.
Or the divine attributes that are coming through them are them.
Right.
You know, like the super athletes that do amazing things and end up with these ginormous egos that eventually
Right.
collapse in on
They
themselves
think
and destroy them.
that higher case S that they are getting in touch with is equivalent to the lowercase s in their normal everyday experience.
Well, people forget that you're aligning with it. It's not you.
Right.
It is and it isn't. But you're kind of coming into it, like you said earlier. You come into alignment with it. You know.
Sure.
It's and when you do, it's flowing.
See, the ego is that force that came in, like you said, in a almost like a defense mechanism type thing.
Primal.
Right, a primal
Primal,
defense
yeah.
mechanism to say, I'll protect you, this ability will protect you from the dangers of the physical surroundings and the physical world that you may encounter so that you can, you know, like you said, get out of the way of a predator or a falling boulder or something to that effect, or know not to go over the cliff, you know, you know, in an unsure or unsafe way.
It's doing the same thing now, even though the ego has expanded. It's okay. This is not my kind of music. I'm going to protect you. This is not my kind of art.
Right.
I'm going to protect. It's doing the same thing that it was planned, that its purpose was, but it's expanded and it's kind of almost taken over.
Yeah.
You know, it's turned the flexibility of the mind into a concrete thing. This is mine, this isn't mine. No flexibility there.
The servant or the tool has become the master. Is attempting to usurp the entire self and
Yes.
keep it kind of imprisoned at a lower level of awareness, because it says, it's basically saying to the individual, I've rescued you. I've allowed you to survive this event and this event and this event.
Right.
And now I'm not going to just be relegated to a simple tool. I'm coming in here and I'm setting up shop and I'm taking over this place.
Right.
I'm not leaving. You know, like a hammer. You know, a hammer is something you go and find when you need to drive a nail. You know, or you need to remove a nail. Okay, it's a tool. You pick it up, you do the action that you need it for, and then you put it down.
Right.
Well, the ego is the tool that we once may have done that with, but eventually we got so used to having it in our hand, and then eventually it like kind of gained a consciousness of its own and is saying, I direct the entire being.
Right.
You're not going to put me down. You know, I'm going to start telling you what to do, and you're going to obey me.
Sure. It's like a catch-22. The ego protects through separation.
Right.
You know, it protects through separation. Now, we've talked about this before. We talked about how you can measure a concept or an idea based on the amount that it makes you feel united with all that is.
That's right.
Now, if something makes you feel separate, well, then it is not a good measure of truth. So you can measure truth based on how it unites or separates.
I agree.
The ego protects, but it separates. So it's illusionary in its very essence.
Right. And a lot of people out there want that sense of protection. You know, they're such in a fear-based modality of consciousness that they think that self-preservation is the highest level of consciousness. You know, in the satanic ideology, if you study the actual philosophy that Satanism puts forward, its highest law is self-preservation and survival. That is the number one thing that is kind of worshipped in the satanic ideal. And this is a dangerous ideology to begin to subscribe to in a very attached way, because you start to think that there is nothing higher than survival. Survival is not a bad thing. Wanting to survive is the goal of, you know, pretty much the base goal of all life. Of course, life wants to survive and propagate itself. But when you start getting into the idea that that's the highest level that you could ever aspire to, that self-preservation is the highest law, that it is the highest modality of consciousness, that definitely isn't true, because there are transcendent modes of consciousness that allow you to see ego is a tool. Survival, yes, you need it to propagate and have experience, but it certainly isn't the highest level of consciousness.
That whole concept of survival and that only exists if you're not understanding the unbroken chain of life that is.
Right.
Because there is no such thing as survival. It's another illusionary concept.
Sure.
There is an unbroken chain of life. There is no such thing as something surviving and something isn't. It is.
The attachment,
you are.
The attachment with that level of awareness, of just survival,
right,
and that being all there is, or the highest thing that there is, comes from the fear of death. And if you understand, like you just said, that life is an unbroken chain, that's right.
Yeah.
You understand ultimately there is no death.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And that is what really, that getting out of that existential mode of consciousness is what really will get you out of that fear mentality, and then get you to aspire to higher levels of consciousness than simply survival and ego identification. Walt, we're going to hold it right there for a few moments. We're coming up to the end of the first hour. Usually what I do at this point is play the intro music for the second hour and reread the event announcements, since the show is broken up over 2 hours on the Revolution Broadcasting Network. So we'll hold it right there, and in the second hour we'll continue to flesh out these ideas about ego identification as one of the barriers to self-realization. So I'm Mark Passio. This is What on Earth is Happening. My website is whatonearthishappening.com. The network is revolutionbroadcasting.com. Be back shortly. In the previous hour, we were talking about the second barrier toward the realization of the true self. Because what we do on this program, ultimately, is we talk about causal factors. That's what this show is about. This is about understanding natural law principles and the causal factors in consciousness of what lead to the events that we experience, that manifest in our lives, and that we experience in the reality that we live in. That's what this show is about. You know, we can talk about the events that play out all we want. We can describe the so-called prison all we want. But until we understand how to attain and turn that key, good luck to us. We're not going to be making very much progress unless we understand what gets us what we have. That's ultimately what I attempt to do here in the ideas that I put forth on this show, and that's the understanding that I am trying to help people to. These are laws that are discovered. They're not invented by anybody. They're not ideas. They're not ideologies, and they are most certainly not beliefs. What I talk about here on this show are laws. Laws that exist within creation that we are bound by. And the only way to really truly discover them from the place in consciousness that we now find ourselves is to shatter the barriers that we ourselves have erected around us and around our consciousness. And they are put there by the institutions that are all around us. They are put there by the generations that have come before us. They are put there by the very system itself that we live under. It has a consciousness unto itself, a consciousness that is fed by those who have come before us and those around us now that subscribe to these belief systems, who do not understand how natural law principles work, quite unfortunately. And quite unfortunately, they keep getting results that they do not wish to experience. This is why I do what I do, to try to help people alleviate self-inflicted suffering. And that's all intricately tied in with the notion of how do we free ourselves? Why aren't we truly free now in this expression of the physical world? Why do we experience the suffering that we do, the immensity of suffering that we do? So this is what we talk about on this show. And in the last hour, myself and my guest Walter Rhodes, a good friend of mine who is an explorer in consciousness and a seeker of truth, we're talking about the second barrier to self-realization, which is ego identification. And throughout the remainder of the show, we're going to flesh out ego identification even more and hopefully tie it in with the prison of the left brain, which is a unidimensional, time-bound way of seeing the world and ourselves in it that has to do with brain imbalance, and that's intricately interwoven with the idea of ego identification.
I mean, but I think...
But not having those bills is a way of appealing to ego, right?
Yeah.
It's difficult even to reach people at that level because they've been shut down at a level of imagination. What they don't really believe is that anything different is possible. They are actually of the opinion that it's always been this way, it is this way now, and it will forever be this way. That's the definition of mind control. That's a later topic.
So the first thing that people have to do is identify their negative ego attachments that are disempowering them.
Right.
Identify them first.
At least recognize that they're present. At all.
Recognize them, identify them, and then start developing things to balance them so that you can...
It's like a drug addict. What's the first step? Stop denying that you have a problem.
Yeah,
you have to at least recognize that you have a problem.
That's an excellent example, because drug addicts, what do? They run around doing drugs,
right.
ruining their life.
Right.
Then they choose a quote-unquote positive ego attachments in the programs.
Sure.
Right? So then they get all wrapped. That's like a positive obsession to balance the negative obsession.
Right.
So now they're all innate, all the time, morning, noon, and night, and that balances.
It even becomes a culture unto itself with friends and a music scene and a whole lifestyle.
But then the attachment that people get to their programs turns it into a negative thing. It it initially was positive, but the attachment to it
Sure.
makes it negative. Because those programs don't develop self-discipline.
Right.
They
And
develop,
eventually what starts to happen? The body starts to break down. You know, different diseases will come in. You know, they'll completely neglect other aspects of their lives, like
Totally.
their job, children, et cetera, other relationships.
any imbalance or obsession leads to a breakdown of some sort.
And that's what we're seeing now, all across
Absolutely.
the earth, in every area, in all aspects of life.
Absolutely.
Because we're attached to ego identification. And the other aspect to this that I was starting to say that I want to get into is what really demonstrates the ego more than anything else are two actual aspects. This is the inability to admit to oneself that one is wrong. It's the inability to say to oneself, or the admission to the universe, if you will, I was wrong about this. That is what deep entrapment, deep attachment to the ego will never allow. It will never allow those three words to be spoken.
Mm-hmm.
And I cannot even tell you how many times in my life I've had to speak those words.
How hard is it to get a tyrant to admit they were wrong?
How hard is it to get an addict to admit that they are wrong, that's addicted to anything?
Right.
How hard is it to get somebody that their entire worldview is based upon that they know this particular thing? I know that this is true for certain. It can't be untrue. That would shatter my entire reality.
That inflexibility makes it null and void.
Yeah.
That totally, it makes it irrelevant. The inflexibility. Now, there may be some truth to it, but no truths are whole truths.
Right.
Everything is a half-truth. And you have to be flexible in that knowledge, no matter what we're talking about. Does that make sense?
Religion and government are great, big examples. That does make sense. Let's look at it from a perspective of people who absolutely trust religious institutions and think that they're always doing good things.
Right.
You know, not only are they doing bad things by propagating the misunderstanding and misapplications of natural law principles or not understanding them themselves. Look at what goes on in sexual encounters and relationships, inappropriate
and trauma like that
oftentimes
for people for life.
Sure.
For the rest of the
traumatic experiences. But how many people who go to church on a regular basis, let's say, and supports the Roman Catholic Church, cannot admit this institution is involved in activity like this, in poisonous activity like this, in traumatic activity that is affecting children. It doesn't matter how many documentaries are produced about it. It doesn't matter how many books are written about it. You know, they can't bring themselves to admit this is happening. This level of evil is happening in their midst. The ego prevents them from looking at that. You know, they insist that this cannot be true because I'm a member of it. You know, I see this every day. You see a teacher who will say, the educational system can't be as bad as what you're claiming it to be. It can't harm children at the level that you're claiming it harms them at, because I'm a teacher. I'm involved. I do this for a living. You're saying I'm a bad person.
So you're challenging the fundament that she built herself from.
That's right. That's that person's identity.
Yeah.
He or she will see themselves as that teacher, which goes back to this first aspect of ego identification, which is attaching to the role that you play, as opposed to understanding the higher self.
When in actuality, that teacher, that example, should have thanked that person for making that comment. Because that person revealed to her the level of her attachment to that idea, which just, it's important to have people around you that do that show you how much you're wrapped up in your own stuff.
That's right. But this also ties in with institutionalized belief systems, which are very powerful. Yeah. It's the same thing that people can't get past. They can't say, I was wrong. I believed this formerly. I once believed that the government was there to truly protect us and take care of us, and it cared about us. And it wouldn't do anything at a deep level to really create harm just so it could profit from it or prosper in ways that it wants or take more control. This is ego. The ego is the force that keeps people from that admission, that keeps people from looking at what's really there, at the truth, what actually has transpired, the wave functions that actually have collapsed to create the events that have already played out, which we call the past,
Amen.
up to the present moment. They're in denial of that, even though that's reality and can never be changed. It's what is. Those wave functions did collapse. They did create events in the present moment, in all the former present moments that we now call the past.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And things are a certain way. They do exist as a certain series of events. But people who are in deep levels of ego attachment, they want to say, oh no, it isn't that way. I deny that. I deny that that is actually what took place. I deny that this is the condition that is actually our present moment that is a result of those things.
Right.
And that's called denial of reality. And we talked about, the name for that condition is called cognitive dissonance. It's deliberately lying to oneself, even though the evidence is all around you. Cognitive dissonance. It's a deep psychological
Lack of
state.
self-acceptance.
Right. Exactly.
That's what it is. It's a deep psychological lack of self-acceptance.
Refusal to accept the truth is refusal to accept
Right.
the self.
Right.
They're one and the same. It's what is.
Right.
You refuse to actually accept what is. And acknowledge that, yes, this is the actual truth of what is taking place.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, people want to put their head in the sand, and they want to say, oh, no, that's not happening. It's like a cancer patient that's withering away with some deep terminal cancer and is still in deep denial and saying, oh, no, I don't have cancer. I don't believe that that's the case. Or an alcoholic is a perfect example. Drinking themselves into a coma practically. All their relationships are destroyed. They're jobless or homeless, but I don't have alcoholism. I'm not an alcoholic. I just like to drink every now and again, but I don't have a real problem. I have it under control. It's okay. That's where we're at collectively. And ego attachment is what keeps us there. It's the inability to admit that we are wrong about something.
So what do we have to admit? We're wrong.
You've got to recognize that there's a problem at all.
First, and then admit you're wrong.
Then admit you were wrong about the former worldview that you once held.
And then acquire
I think
more.
I had to do this, I'd say, about 250, 300,000 times
Right.
in the past.
Right.
At least.
Right. And then acquire a worldview that is uniting instead of separating.
Right.
Right. And then what?
Well, you were talking about how do you do that? How do you even search for that? How do you go about getting that if you're in a kind of a cornered position where you've separated from that so long you don't even know what that thing looks like or how it works?
Right.
You have no knowledge of it. And this is the second part of ego attachment that I think we took a walk earlier before the show, and I started bringing up this notion. This is the side of ego that thinks it already knows everything, okay? And I would never, ever, ever make that statement, that I know everything, that I know the totality of creation in the mind of God. No one does. There's always more to understand. There's always more knowledge to acquire and know. But I don't think it means you can never admit that you do know what you already have come to understand. There's nothing wrong with admitting you understand 2 + 2 = 4, because it does. That's the truth. You can understand the acceleration due to gravity in the Earth's field,
Right.
the Earth's gravitational field. This is a law you can come to know.
Now,
you can
I mean,
understand karmic principles.
Yeah, but you're never going to understand the totality of it. But that shouldn't stop you from pursuing an empowering truth.
Right. That's correct. So it's a basic fundamental principle. No one is saying that they can come to know the totality of the mind of God.
Right.
That's not what's being claimed here.
Right.
What ego attachment keeps people in is this notion that they already know everything they need to know to get by in life. They don't need to acquire any more knowledge. They never actually say the other three extremely empowering and important and powerful words. I don't know. To say I was wrong is the most powerful thing that I think can ever be uttered from a human mouth, making an apology. because you're admitting you were in a place of ignorance, you're coming from a place of not lack of understanding, and now you're saying, I now have at least the consciousness to say that was not the truth. And I held on to it, I was attached to it, and now I'm saying I'm no longer attached to that. I was wrong. But the next thing that has to be said is I don't know. I'm aware of what level I don't understand. And that's the only way you start moving upward in consciousness and in knowledge. The beginning of all knowledge starts with the utterance, I don't know. And that sounds like a negative statement, but it's an extremely empowering and positive statement.
Right. No, absolutely. Because once you realize that these ego attachments aren't you, well, you have to start to question, well, who am I then?
Right.
And if your first response after clearing away the crap isn't, I don't know who I am,
that's right.
well, then you're not starting from the right point.
Absolutely. That's a
I don't know who I am is the perfect way to start.
Right.
I don't know.
And that's the perfect way of putting it. You have to empty out. It's been said in different teachings, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to fill a glass that has already been filled.
Right.
Until space is made and certain negative tendencies and attachments are cleared away, you can't make space for something new to come in.
Right.
And that begins with the process. Okay, I was wrong about that. I am willing. I have the will to let go of that now. But I want to know now.
Right.
And I realize I don't know. Then the next step is, well, who do you listen to? Where do you go? You go to people that have changed their lives through the understanding of the knowledge you want to acquire. So you don't go to people who are still trapped in deep levels of self-inflicted suffering. You go to people that are pretty much at peace with themselves because they've come to understand who they are, and they don't inflict suffering upon others.
But you are very careful and not signing up for a new worldview.
Right.
You know, so yeah, you're going to people who have changed and who have made that transition, but you don't acquire a new worldview from them. You have to be careful not
taking it on faith or belief from them.
Right.
What you would do is learn how they did it,
right,
how they changed themselves, and then follow along in that basic general methodology.
Like a skeleton outline,
right,
and you filling in.
Exactly. It's like, you want to understand how to make great tasting food. You wouldn't go to somebody that can't boil water. You'd go to a master chef and try to study under them.
Right.
It's the same thing. It isn't turning that person into a guru and saying that, oh, you're my intermediary between the divine.
No. It's like when in sports you play with people. You play with the best people out there because they will bring you up to their level.
Correct.
You will be pulled up to that level. So
that's right.
Surround yourself with people that are above your level. Keep the bar high, continually reach.
Yep.
And eventually, you'll get it.
Now, hand in hand with that, before we close up, I just have to allude to this because we'll be talking about this in future shows. The thing that keeps people from even developing the desire to get out of that base modality of consciousness and ego identification is the constant bombardment of your powerlessness. You're powerless. You can't do it. And that's called mind control.
Right. And it's a big mind control technique that I just dawned on me the other day. Guilt.
Sure.
Media-induced guilt.
That's right.
It's Mother's Day. What are you going to buy for your mom? It's Mother's Day. It's Mother's Day. All good sons and daughters buy their mother's presents.
Right.
It's Mother's Day. Well, that's a mind control technique that's pushed via the media to get you to purchase.
Absolutely.
Now, that's so insidious. Now,
we have 30 seconds left in the show. Unfortunately, Walt, I'd like to have you back on in a future show, but we're totally running out on time here. We're going to have to wrap it up for this week. That's a great point that you brought up there about guilt. We'll be talking about mind control in future weeks. For now, we're going to wrap it up. I'm Mark Passio. I've been here with Walter Rhodes this evening. This is What on Earth is Happening. See you next week.
So what is the intuition actually telling us? I think what the intuition tells us is that true free will is when a choice is determined by ourselves. It is determined It's not random. It's not a throw of the dice, but it's determined by that which we identify ourselves with. Nobody identify themselves with electrochemical processes in their brains. They identify themselves with their subjective inner life. So as long as the choice is made by their subjective inner life, determined by that, by their psychological archetypes, their previous experiences, their memories, predispositions, and so on, it is free will. Now, notice how I defined it. Free will is when the choice of an agent is determined by that which the agent identifies itself with. So free will is determined by identification. What do you identify yourself with? If you identify yourself with your ego, then the rest of your psyche is determining what you feel. You have no free will. You're unconscious, that handy clinical definition. Mm-hmm. Your unconscious is determining your neuroses, your compulsions, your depression, everything. What free will do you have? It determines even your choices of your partner by unconscious projection. You have no free will if you identify with your ego. Maybe you can choose what's the best health insurance or the best route to work, but it's extremely limited. Now, if you bring the unconscious into awareness through practicing conscious living, which is a term you like to use, if you identify yourself with the very ground of existence, which is awareness itself, the thing that underlies everything that is or can be, your free will is unlimited. Yeah. Because free will is determined by identification.
Yeah,
that's my position, at least.
I really, really, really like that explanation, and I think it says so much also about, even if we look at other philosophies and spiritual disciplines, even from Buddhism and such, the aspect of attachment is our downfall in so many different areas. And so if we start to see this connection between, how do I think I have a choice in life? How big is my field of choice? And what my attachments are, it's incredible what, processes start to open up for us and then start to open up our choice field.